Yeah, so we're excited to talk to you about ChatGPT and generative AI kind of as a broader category of these types of algorithms and capabilities. Like Tim said, we'll kick things off here with just some brief introductions. So my background is not in data science originally or natural language processing. I did a PhD in astronomy, which was a lot of fun, did a lot of data processing and different kinds of modeling, and then transitioned after I graduated into industry and with KPMG, where I've really focused on NLP in particular for the past 5 or 6 years. So things have changed quite a lot since I started working in the NLP space, and they just keep moving quite rapidly. So things like this are exciting to talk about when they come up, and what's real and what's not real. So looking forward to diving into more of that today. And Tim, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, I'm Tim Cerino. We're in capital markets and the financial services industry prior to KPMG. I've been here for about 8 years, working very closely with Rachel and the rest of our data science team on natural language processing kinds of engagements where we're basically training AI systems to read and interpret complex documents. And so we have a lot of interest in what's happening right now on the generative AI front.
Thanks, Tim. All right, so let's dive right into it. Feel free, I'll kind of try to pause at the end of each slide, and if you have questions, feel free to like raise your hand or just come off mute and let us know what your question is. We do want this to be interactive. We took note of the survey, so thank you for those of you who responded to the survey, and we'll try to hit on those points and provide some examples as we go through the talk today. But kind of starting with the basics, what is generative AI? And in general, it's a type of algorithm, so it's a mathematical model, and it's trained on huge amounts of data. So just massive amounts of examples. In this case, we're going to focus on text, but it could also be audio. You might have seen some of the image generation generative AI algorithms where you type in some text and it makes up an image for you. But it's really just a bunch of math trying to look for patterns in the data that it's been provided, and then using those patterns that it's learned to try to generate new content. So that's kind of what generative AI is at a very high level. They're not really, and this gets into some of the questions that I know you all have about like ownership and creativity and copyright protections and things like that. Nothing that these generative AI models create are completely new. They're kind of taking bits and pieces of everything that they've seen and blending it together, or kind of averaging or combining, or you can think of it as interpolating or extrapolating based on what it's seen in the training data that it's seen. So it's not entirely new, as some of you are probably getting at and concerned about with some of these cases. It's building based on pulling things from what it's already seen. It's not just creating out of nothing. And so how do these things come to be? How do these generative AI models get created? I'm going to give a little bit of background on that. So GPT is this acronym that we all keep saying. It stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And to kind of break that down, because it's just a bunch of jargon, a transformer is a particular kind of deep learning architecture. That's pretty much it. So again, just a fancy word for a lot of math. And then pre-trained means not we personally, but like the people who trained it gave it a huge amount of data to pre-train on, to learn from. And then the generative part is the part that is interesting and catching everyone's attention because it's generating new content based on what it's seen. So that's kind of what generative pre-trained transformer means. That's the GPT. And there's actually 2 pieces to differentiate here. There's GPT-3, which is this huge large language model that's trained on just enormous amounts of data. Have the 45 terabytes. Actually, I think it might be bigger than that of data. So huge amounts of data. It's trained on that, and then ChatGPT is actually trained on top of GPT-3. So it's actually like model on top of a model, an algorithm on top of an algorithm. So huge amounts of data are needed to make this happen. Additionally, huge amounts of compute time are needed to make that happen, which is very expensive. These things can train for months and months. That's how long it takes to train these enormous models. And that can cost millions of dollars. So it's not anything that like just any random company is going to decide they want to do. You have to have the resources to make it happen. So there's kind of a barrier to entry to creating these types of models and training these types of models, in addition to needing the specialists, the kind of data science, machine learning experts to know how to build them. There's a lot of barriers there. And so how it kind of works, and this isn't necessarily specific to GPT and generative AI, this is kind of just generally how do we build models. But you get a bunch of input data. That input data is aligned with what you want the model to do. So do you want the model to predict how many people are going to come into your store tomorrow, or do you want it to predict what the next word in the sentence should be, like ChatGPT does? And so you collect all of that data. You clean it up, ideally, to remove things that are irrelevant or unwanted. So for example, with ChatGPT, you want to remove offensive data or biased data. We'll talk more about that. There's also a conversion step where you take the data and put it into numbers, because again, this is all math underneath. So you take the text and you have to convert it into numbers. The same with images or audio. And then you throw the mathematical algorithm at it, which in this case is a neural network. Again, just a big fancy mathematical algorithm. It learns from the data, the algorithm learns from the data, and then that output is presented to users when that model is used to predict something new. Or in the case of ChatGPT, it's prompted by the user to generate something. And then that generation is provided to the user. And in the case of ChatGPT and many other generative AI algorithms, there's also kind of a filtering layer to get rid of or try to catch offensive content before it reaches the user, because you don't want things, your generative AI generating things that are offensive or just horrible, toxic things. So usually there's some kind of guardrails put into place at the very end after the model prediction to protect the user as best as possible. And again, not always perfect, but we'll talk more about that as well. But that's kind of the overview of like, what is it, trying to demystify it a little bit about where these things came from. Kind of feels like the news kind of came out of the blue, but it didn't. This has been going on for a while. And so hopefully this helps to demystify a little bit. I'll pause there for questions. Anyone have any immediate questions before we talk a little bit more about how it works? Okay, Tim, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more in detail there.
Yeah, so demystifying just at the kind of like the next level down from what Rachel was saying. And obviously this can get super technical, but just I think it's important at a high level to try to have a handle on it. And I think it's pretty accessible. So like Rachel's saying, there's these two parts within it, a probabilistic language model, and like obviously language and linguistics is really interesting and really complicated. Within the computer, it's actually like surprisingly simple. So like one way to think about it is like all those documents that Rachel's describing being ingested. What the machine does is it looks at any given word and it tries to figure out what's the probability of the next word. So like you take in 1 million documents and like say you want to start with the word shoe, there might be a 50% chance that the next word is laces, and there might be a 30% chance that the next word is leather and the next word is something else. And then you basically just chain all of those probabilities together to generate text. It's a little more sophisticated than that, but a term you'll hear is sometimes word embeddings. So for a given word or phrase, it's basically just saying what's the next most likely thing to happen. So like sometimes it's obvious, like if your prompt is knock knock, like pretty much anybody would know that the next thing that's meant to be said is who's there, versus if you prompt or begin with I saw the, like you have no idea what the next thing is. It could be any noun really, and probably any adjective followed by a noun. So that is like a simple idea of like what a language model is under the hood, but hold that thought, it'll reveal itself as we go along. The second piece is there's a lot of knowledge management in here. So like there's in the GPT models, there's a huge database of content that's sort of positioned. So like if you prompt it with what are the houses at Hogwarts, it's not looking at the probabilities of words coming after one another. Rather, it's like almost like a search engine where it's like, oh, I know that prompt, I recognize that, and it's just going to tell you what the 4 houses are. Like that's all sort of set in there. And there's tons of like factual information that's been put in there by literally hundreds of thousands of subject matter experts in the training and creation of ChatGPT. So a lot of what it seems to know is like really just content that's there. If you ask it to do something creative, and Rachel's got some cool examples, which she's going to show you in a minute, it's pretty formula driven. So a good thing to do is sign up for it and then hit it with the same prompt many times in a row, and you'll quickly see the scaffolding. So like if you ask it to make up a story, this thing in italics, once upon a time there was it's from Pixar's 22 Rules of Storytelling, but I think it's pretty standard, recipe for how to make a story. It's kind of almost like Mad Libs. and we'll show you some examples. I think Rachel's already covered a bunch of this. A couple things I'll highlight is because that training takes a long time to run and a lot of money and compute power, this ChatGPT and the GPT models were trained in the past once. And so like what's in there is content up to and through September 2021, and that's it. We'll show you some examples that reveal that limitation. There's a limitation on how much content you can put into it. So you can say, hey, ChatGPT, summarize this 1,000-word piece below, and you can paste in the 1,000 words and it'll summarize it. But if you give it like a 10,000-word article or a 100,000-word book, like it's going to say, sorry, you've exceeded my limits for how much text I can handle. So, you know, I think a lot of this audience is in the field of writing, and that's not that much. So you'll see that come up. Talked about guardrails. And then last thing is these models have a property of what's being called hallucination, which is where it'll just start to generate gibberish or weird stuff, or it's really programmed to give you an answer no matter what, and the answer might be total nonsense. So it's really important for anybody that's using these tools to look closely at what it's telling you, because it might make sense or it might not.
Thanks, Deb.
I think we got some good examples coming up.
Yeah, I want to dive right into some of the examples to really bring to life some of the topics that we were just talking about. So these are some of the examples that we'll go through, but kind of just to demonstrate what Tim was talking about for fact-based prompts. If you need to retrieve information similar to a search engine, you should really have like the exact same answer for essentially the same question. So we'll give an example about that. Creative prompts, you would expect to kind of give something new each time. I guess there's a question of what new exactly means. But so we'll show an example of that. It can't know what it hasn't seen. And some of this is the kind of time limitation that Tim was just talking about. It can't know recent events because it was trained in the past. And so it doesn't have information about those things. It also can't know what it hasn't seen. So we have an example that we'll show where it gives a very generic response to a prompt, but it doesn't reflect any of the specifics that we know about that thing. And we're using work as an example for that one. And then it also struggles to connect the dots across pieces of knowledge that should be associated together, and kind of doing that inference that a human would do, the critical thinking that a human would do. It struggles to do that in a lot of cases. So to dive into some of these examples, the first one is Harry Potter example again. So what are the main characters? And you can ask this question in just very slightly different ways, and you get different answers. So we asked once, what are the main characters, and the other time we asked who are the principal characters. And you can see it gives a very different list. One is like more than twice as long as the other. But this should be a very deterministic response in asking the same question. And this actually goes to a brand new field that is popping up called prompt engineering. So it's kind of like how you ask the question affects how your response is generated from the algorithm. And because of that kind of interdependency between what words do you use, how do you phrase your question, and what response do you get, it's not deterministic. And so you can kind of engineer what's the best way to optimize this, to optimize how you're phrasing the question to get the response that you want or you intend. So that's a whole new field that's popped up called prompt engineering, like specifically focused on how do you best phrase the request to the generative AI algorithm. So that's one example. You ask for the same information, but you get two different answers at least. And really, they should be the same. So going to the creative prompt example, you'd kind of expect to get quite different responses from a creative prompt, but like Tim was talking about before, we asked for a short story in the style of Harry Potter, and we asked that prompt twice, and the content is different, but as Tim mentioned, it's still kind of generic. It follows the exact same storyline. So even when you ask it for something creative, it follows kind of the exact same pattern. So, there's a limit to its creativity, I guess is the point here. It's like, yes, they're both very different stories in this example. One's about Alex running through the forest, and the other one's about Lily and a book. But they follow very much the same pattern and the same structure. And so, some people have said that they can start to tell ChatGPT's style because of this kind of aspect of it, is you can kind of tell when it's using the same formula to generate slightly different responses. So hopefully that makes sense. A couple other examples, and then I'll stop for questions again. So again, when we were talking about it can't know what it hasn't seen, so part of this is the date kind of cut off at September 2021. But we also asked it, and this information is out on the internet. One of the things that Tim and I both work on is our AI platform at KPMG called Ignite. And so we asked it, tell us what this thing does. That information's out there, it exists, it's public information, and yet the example that it gave and generated for us here is just very generic information about what an AI platform might do. It's missing a really key part here, which is the focus area of Ignite is natural language processing, but that doesn't show up at all in the description, the marketing description that it's come up with for us. So kind of goes to one of the points that we'll revisit a couple times, which is can be good for first drafts, but this isn't something you would just copy paste or fully automate end to end, because you can't just go and use this. It has nothing specific to what we actually do in this example of a marketing summary. So we would have to take this maybe as a starting point, but then add in a bunch of stuff that's more specific about what we actually do with Ignite. Okay, one more example, and then I'll pause for questions. So it can't know what it hasn't seen. So this is a few examples on the time. So again, the data was only up until 2021, September 2021, that was included in the training of the model. So anything after that, it doesn't know about. So, and it has kind of different responses when you ask it about things that are after that period of time. So in one case over here, when we ask what laws passed in Washington State this year, that's where I live, and it says explicitly, my data only goes up to September 2021, so it can't really adequately answer this. And so it just instead gives a canned answer about how laws pass in Washington State, which wasn't really what I was going for. When we ask it about other current events, it tells us that we're incorrect altogether, which obviously isn't true, because this did happen. The FTX did collapse, and obviously there was a war that started last year. So this kind of shows the limitations of what it can't know what it hasn't seen. And so that time period aspect is a big part of that. So I'll pause here again, and in case there are any questions. We have a couple more examples, but I want to make sure we address anyone's questions that you might be thinking of.
Looks like there's a question in the chat. To explain natural language processing a bit, I think.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So natural language processing is kind of like applying algorithms to linguistics. So understanding language, but understanding it kind of from a data-driven way, as opposed to kind of like a cultural way. Not that those two don't have overlap, but it's kind of a set of tools that we use from a computation and an algorithmic standpoint to understand text and work with text. That's a very generic answer, but it's like one example is natural language processing tools to count up the number of times words appear in a document, and then you can create metrics on that and understand what words are most important or most distinguishing about that document. And so it's kind of just this very broad set of tools, everything from statistics and rule-driven approaches, kind of the deterministic approach, to understanding language and working with language, as well as kind of the algorithmic approach of using as much data as you have to understand patterns in the text that you have. So I'm not sure if that was the best explanation. I don't know, Tim, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I guess it's like the complement to like, if you think about like data processing and statistics, like it's working over like loads of numbers, like what we call structured data, and like natural language processing is like, yeah, like Rachel's saying, it's a huge bag of tricks of things that you can do with text, kind of in the same way. So what else is there? I guess we can do, you can analyze like the sentiment of text. You can summarize things. You can, there's something called topic modeling, where you can say like, given a whole bunch of articles, like what are the topics of each one, or like put them into different categories. We can retrieve information from documents using natural language processing. So yeah, it's basically just like a whole bunch of different procedures that, like Rachel's saying, that we can do with text.
Yeah, and it's a whole set of things that grows wider every time something new
Yeah.
comes out like this. And I see the other question in the in the chat about given that the data is limited, does that mean that the concern is unfounded for employers that are worried about proprietary data leakage? Yes and no. There is some question, I think. I'll have to double check they recently changed some of the conditions around how the data that gets sent to ChatGPT is used. As with many APIs, not just ChatGPT, but a lot of the other cloud services, a lot of times the agreement when you're using that service is that the data that you send to that service can be used for that company, whoever's providing that API, to retrain their models. So a lot of the cloud services have this. Like if you're sending a document to Google to have converted from an image of text to actual machine readable text, they might use the data that you send to that API to further improve their model. So this is something that I think might have recently changed with ChatGPT in particular, but oftentimes just in general, APIs will use your data to make the models better. So there is still that concern. I do think ChatGPT did recently change their terms and conditions to say that, at least in this phase of their development, if you send things to ChatGPT, it will be used to further improve the model. But I mean, it's subject to change, just the terms and conditions. That's why it's important for us all to remember to read the terms and conditions before we send data out. But I don't think that fear is unfounded. I think it depends on what API you're using and being very careful about not sending data to APIs that might use that data to further improve their model. And so I know even Amazon has told their employees don't send your data to ChatGPT or a lot of other APIs as well. So that's definitely a concern for companies who are worried about that. It's a good question. Okay, I will move on to another couple examples here. I think this last one is about connecting the dots. And this one's interesting for those of you who are motivated to explore on your own as well. But this was an example that Tim had come up with. Two separate questions here from To Kill a Mockingbird, like who are Scout and Atticus Finch, and so it gives a nice little summary there of who those characters are in the novel. And then separately, if you open another chat with ChatGPT and ask if Scout should ask Atticus for a raise, it gives you a very generic answer about how you might go about deciding whether or not to give someone a raise, how you might, position yourself for a raise, but it's not connecting these two pieces of information. Now, the one thing that has improved, I think, with ChatGPT and is it does have some memory of the history of the conversation. So if you actually ask this first question and then the second question, it does a better job of connecting the dots. But by itself, it has a really hard time connecting the dots. Like it seems like totally different pieces of information to the ChatGPT model. And so that's something to keep in mind as well when we're thinking about what it can do and what it can't do. And we'll get into that next when we talk about workforce and implications for the workforce. It's like it does have a hard time with the critical thinking step. It's a limitation. Like as humans, this might be more obvious to us, but for this just mathematical model, it has a hard time understanding that this question about one thing and this question about another thing are related at all. It can't make those connections. So yeah, that final example there. So oh, one question in the chat about other products being developed right now that will be competitors for ChatGPT. Yes, absolutely. Right now it's mostly tech companies. So Google has announced that they will eventually be releasing their own version of ChatGPT, which is called Bard. It's not open for general testing and use yet, but they are definitely in on this. And there's a few other companies as well who are kind of in this race for these large language models and generative AI. It is challenging, like we were talking about before. There's a price barrier to entry, there's a tech specialist barrier to entry, there's a data barrier to entry. So it's definitely challenging. So there's not a lot of people in this space right now, but there definitely are a couple competitors directly in the creating these types of model space. And then there's a lot of kind of the product space around this, which I think is what you're getting at, the question of like, how can you use these tools to then do XYZ and help people do XYZ. So with that, maybe we'll transition to what are the implications for the workforce. Tim, I'll hand it over to you for this slide.
All right, so I'll start off. I guess as far as the competitors go, I'd say before we get into the workforce thing, yeah, evaluate what's there, but I'd say critical thinking and skepticism is pretty important. Like Facebook launched a large language model called Galactica, which was trained, they said trained on scientific journal articles exclusively. And that model turned out to hallucinate heavily. Like it would say lots of very weird things that made no sense at all. And they actually had to take it down after a couple of days because it was just not ready. It'll be back, I imagine, but like things launched. There was also one that surfaced that claimed to do legal, like your legal work for you. But as near as anybody could tell, it's like you type in a question and it says that it'll get back to you within 3 to 4 hours. So it probably is just people responding to the prompts, and it probably isn't a generative AI model at all. So, you know, yeah, just evaluate everything carefully.
Beware.
Yeah, user beware, certainly. So implications for work and workforce. So this is kind of like our, you know, we've all been talking about this pretty heavily, as I'm sure a lot of you have. This is kind of our 2 cents on where we're kind of thinking about this at the moment. So obviously this is one of these big moments, like it's transformative, disruptive, opportunity for growth through like careful, critical, iterative adaptation. Not to read the slide at you, but like this is probably one of those moments where it's like something big like computer or the web browser or the spreadsheet or something that comes out where it tends to shake things up. And because it's new and different, it's often like really confusing and may feel threatening, and it may feel like this really obscure, like black box, you don't know what it is. So like, these are some historical examples. The person in the black and white picture, if you don't recognize her, is Ada Lovelace, who with Charles Babbage came up with the first mechanical adding machine in 1837. Just, you know, a mechanical adding machine. It was an awesome, amazing innovation at the time. But like when they were, people found out about it, they were kind of asked to present it to like high society in the United Kingdom and British royals and stuff. And like the people that were observing it would ask Ada Lovelace, like, does this machine believe in God? Like, can it feel love? You know, what are its interests? And like Lovelace and Babbage were just stumped because they're like, it's just a bunch of gears. Like, it's just a hunk of metal. But like, it was so novel at the time that it blew people's minds. And in the same way, a lot of these other things, when they came out, like I'm old enough to remember, like my dad brought home like a hand calculator when I was like a little kid. And it was like astounding that this thing could, you know, add numbers. And then I worked with somebody, you know, when the early internet came out, you know, I worked with somebody who was like, when Wikipedia landed, he was basically like, well, I guess that's it for books. Like libraries should just get rid of all their books. It's over. There's no more need for that. And obviously none of that really came to pass. Some disruptive technologies, I suppose, between email and WordPerfect, you know, at one time, you know, probably business people had administrative assistants who would take dictation and type up letters for you and stuff. But like, I think people that were doing those things probably went on to do more useful things with their brains, and, you know, professionals who needed to have documents produced are, I think, generally finding it easier to just type it up yourself, kind of a thing. So I think that, you know, and when spreadsheets came out, I think, obviously I wasn't around for that, but I think there was a lot of hue and cry that this will be the end of accountants, so this will be the end of bookkeepers or whatever. But really, I think the best way to look at any of this stuff, and the way that we look at AI and KPMG, is like, it's a force multiplier. It's not like going to eat all the jobs, but rather it's like, try to be as constructive with it as possible. Like if you're writing, like, it's a great way to avoid writer's block. Just prompt it with whatever it is that you want written, and you'll get like something back right away. And it may be terrible, but like if good writing is good editing, like you've got your starting point. And maybe you prompt it with the same thing. Like you see, like if you ask it like a slightly different version of the question, you'll get a bunch of you'll get different answers. So you can get a lot of raw material to start editing off of. And if you're making artwork, you know, if there's an assignment to, you know, make a picture of a hotel on a beach in the moonlight or whatever, you can prompt Mid-Journey or one of the image ones to generate like 100 different versions of that image as a line drawing or as a painting or as a photograph or whatever. And then, you know, with that out of the way, you can then sort of start to, you know, get the ideas that you like and then start to create your own based on those sort of rough ideas in a way that's like just not possible before. So I think try to think of it as a tool. Definitely get an account as soon as you can. It's free. The image generating ones are free. The text generating ones are free, and just experiment with it, and you'll see pretty quickly what it's useful for, what its limitations are. In the same way that, like, you know, a word processor is handy, but it's not the end of the be all and end all of everything. And like searching the internet is useful, but it's not the be all and end all of everything. Like a Google search is not going to replace people. And I think it's going to be like that, where this is like a pretty awesome tool, but that's probably the extent of it. I think there's new professional opportunities, like Rachel was saying. You know, prompt engineering is a thing people are putting on their resumes. And if you set up an account and get a handle for what happens when you prompt it in different ways, maybe you can call yourself a prompt engineer. There's really no rules about this stuff. Subject matter experts are very important, and the creators of OpenAI and Scale AI and other creators of these things are actively employing people to be subject matter experts to fill this up with domain knowledge of different kinds. So that is, I just had lunch with somebody from Scale AI that's, you know, saying that they've put over 400,000 people to work on putting content into the GPT models. So, you know, that's definitely out there. And I think, like all these things, you know, the best use cases for the web, for email and all that are, you know, took a long time to, they didn't happen on day one. Like they kind of showed up over time as people started using these things. So I don't want to sound too like Pollyanna-ish, if you will, but like I think that there's a lot of possibilities here for making a constructive use of these things. And I think, like anything else, I'd recommend just, you know, try it, get your hands dirty, see what comes of it, and you know, you'll probably start to generate, you know, some pretty great ideas that the creators of these things have never thought of.
Thanks, Tim. And I know there was a question in the chat about you know, approaching creative work. We do have some comments and a slide on like the ownership, copyright, legal issues. So we will definitely get to that. I know that was like the top thing on the survey that you all wanted to talk about. So we'll definitely get there.
Yeah.
But yeah, let us know if there are any other questions. Wanted to briefly touch a little bit further on like what we're seeing already in terms of workforce and like applications. We've heard a lot from educators, understandably. But like Tim was just saying, it's really just another tool on the internet that they can use. It's not really that different than them using Google or Wikipedia, because a lot of the material that they would get by searching Wikipedia or Google is probably what ChatGPT is drawing from. You know, maybe it takes them slightly less time, but it's, you know, it's another tool similar to that. And if possible, I know this isn't true in all cases, but like the way to think about it is like ask your students to do things that generative AI can't do. One of those big things is citing where their information comes from. This is true both for the image generation and for the text generation. It can't cite its sources. So if you ask your students to cite their sources, if they're using ChatGPT, they will have a hard time doing that. They're still going to have to do a lot of work to take what was created by ChatGPT and then do the back engineering to figure out where the sources for that information actually is. That's just not something that these generative AI models can do, because the innards of the model are so mathematically complex. It's next to impossible to trace where the sources came from. And so that's a challenge that these generative AI techniques are going to have to solve, both from being able to cite where you're getting information from to validate it, but also from like potentially going to our future slide on ownership, copyright, legal, being able to understand where that content came from, what was being used to generate this, and attributing those people in an appropriate way to give them credit. But anyway, so that's challenges at school. We're definitely seeing that already. You know, it's essentially plagiarism to copy paste what's from ChatGPT, but there are ways around it where possible for educators. And then content creation, kind of going to what Tim was saying, and to what we're also talking about on the ownership thing. You can use it to generate visuals. You know, some of the image generation ones like Midjourney and Dolly, you can create images. It's unclear how you are allowed to use those now and going forward. That's very likely to change, but people are kind of using it as like a brainstorming partner, like prompt it with something and then use that to then further get ideas and kind of go back and forth as just, you know, like you had someone to brainstorm with if you didn't actually have a human being there with you. But then there is that problem about getting credit for your work. If you're a creator and your stuff is on the internet and your work was scraped and pulled into the data that was used to train this model, then your work is in there without your permission, and that is absolutely a problem. And so we'll talk a little bit. There's a legal case that's ongoing right now about that. We also have a great example that Tim found on the next slide about like clear plagiarization in the image space. So I'll show that in a second. And then just elaborating on what Tim was just saying about kind of think of it as a first draft. I personally would not trust anything that came out of ChatGPT to be correct. And so for me, it's like everything that it writes for you, you got to do a sanity check on it. And that's also where the subject matter experts are still going to be really critical. Doesn't matter whether it's legal or medical or educational, whether it's historical, scientific, whatever. It's only going to be a first draft. You have to check and make sure it's not making something up, that it's, you know, saying things that are true. That's just going to continue to be a problem. But it can be good for first drafts. Like it's easier to take in. For me, I write a lot of emails, right? So it's great if someone can draft an email for me. I can make some tweaks and then send it out. That's great. That saves me a lot of time. But it's still first draft, and I still have to make those edits on top of the draft that was provided to me. So it can be helpful and can save an individual time on a very specific task. But at least at this point, I don't see anything being fully automated by this type of technology, just given all of the issues that we're seeing.
Yeah. And hey, Rachel, you're reminding me of with the school thing. I think somebody wrote an essay or an article a few months ago about the death of the college essay. But like, if you saw from the prompts, like, what are you going to do? Say, write me a college essay. It'll just write. It doesn't matter if me or Rachel or any of you prompt it with that. You'll get the exact same thing with like slight variation. So it's not personalized. It doesn't know anything about who's prompting it. So like, you know, it's a real hard limitation. So you know,
and like we saw with the story, it's very formulaic. Like it has its own style of writing and it follows a specific formula. So if you're an educator and you get 10 essays that essentially follow the exact same structure, they might have all asked ChatGPT to write the essay for them.
Good point.
Okay. So some additional questions in the chat. Actually, let me show this example image really quick. I'll leave that up while we talk about the questions in the chat. So this is the example of the very clearly plagiarized image. It's from Getty. You can tell it's there. It's like it switched some things in the photo, but otherwise, I mean, it's clear where it's not always clear where things come from, but this case, it's very clear where they got the data for generating the image on the right. The image on the left is the original, of course. Anyway, I'll just leave that up. The longer I stare at the image on the right, the more concerning it looks with the issues that are wrong in the image. But I'll leave that up while we answer the questions in the chat. I don't understand the reference to the singularity, so apologies for that. But if you mean like general artificial intelligence, I personally don't believe it'll ever reach that point. But Tim, I don't know what your opinion is.
Yeah, I think the singularity is from a movie or science fiction or something where it's like the computers become smarter than the people, and then we become enslaved by it. Yeah, I don't. You know, take a Python class, write some code. You'll quickly figure out that, like, yeah, that's not happening anytime soon. Computers are like really, really good at adding lots of numbers or editing images or video, but they don't. Yeah, it's not the same as intelligence. So yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I agree. I have a hard time seeing if we ever reach that point. But I mean, maybe I'm just not imaginative enough. Maybe in 500 years we will reach that point. I don't know, but at least not in my lifetime. I don't think it's going to happen. It's like you can give a human a million data points, but if that's all they have, you know, a human can reason with those data points and understand and connect the dots and just use everything you've learned and experienced in life, which is more than what can be reduced to a bunch of numbers. But a bunch of numbers is all these machine learning algorithms ever see. So there's like a big piece missing from these models, which is that human aspect. And I know it looks impressive, but they've seen a lot of data, so they can spit a lot of data back at you. But the actual reasoning, the actual creation, the critical thinking, those are things that we're just nowhere near yet. And I continue to say to a lot of my clients, at the end of the day, these models are dumb. They only know what you teach them to know. I think that's still true, even though this particular type of model has billions and billions of data points, but it's still true. It only knows what you tell it to know and what you teach it to know. But to the other question, when hackers steal these models and release them on the dark web with no filters and safety checks, I don't know, that's going to be a bad day for sure. I don't know exactly what happens, but I mean, that's what we definitely want to avoid. And one of our next topics is, so next we're going to talk about creativity, ownership, attribution. But after that, we want to talk a little bit about ethics and risk and trust. And I think that question kind of goes to that broader topic. So hopefully we'll address some of that question then. Tim, anything you want to add before we move on?
Yeah, it's like probably hard because like the amount of money that's been sunk into OpenAI at this point. I mean, Microsoft invested $1 billion into getting OpenAI up and running, and they're talking about putting in another 10 billion. Like this isn't like, hackers in high school like doing this on their home computer. Like the compute resources and the resources that have gone into this are just beyond, what I think hackers could do anytime soon. But it also comes to like removing filters. Like at the end of the day, it's almost like the computer is almost irrelevant. Like a person could write something really offensive. Like you don't need a machine to intermediate writing something horrible. Like, people can be very unfiltered and sadly sometimes are. So
yeah, that's true. We don't need machines to be offensive for us.
Yeah.
Humans have that covered. Okay, I know this will be a big topic, so I'll just talk briefly on each of these points. We've already talked a little bit about creativity, kind of helping with the blank page problem. At the same time, it can't help you if you're accidentally plagiarizing something or on purpose plagiarizing something, like we were talking about, it can't cite its sources, so there are definitely some limitations there. Attribution, like we were just saying, it can't cite its work. So there are definitely issues there for ownership and getting credit for the work that individuals have done and put on the internet. And like I was referring to, like the math underneath is so complicated, you can't like reverse engineer it unless it's a very obvious one, like the image that we were just looking at. It's really hard to identify like what are the pieces of information that the model used to blend, average, interpolate to create what it gave to you. There's no way to do that right now, which is a problem. And so all of that leads into the ownership question. And kind of going back a step, where is this data coming from that the model is trained on? And this goes into the ethical questions as well. But the data that is used to train the model, 60% of it, the majority by far compared to the other data sources, is something called the common crawl. That absolutely has a lot of copyrighted material in there. Books, news articles, many, many other things. There's like 60 million internet domains, so internet like URL types that are in common crawl. So a lot of people's work are included in that data set. And that data set is a big part of what goes into these large language models, these generative AI models, including ChatGPT. So that's a problem. Common crawl itself, so ignoring ChatGPT and generative AI, the common crawl is covered under fair use claims. So limited use of the information from common crawl without permission for public interest. But that's a very narrow use case. Well, compared to everything else, but it's a somewhat narrow use case of, you can use it without permission for public interest. Researchers will sometimes use common crawl, just as an example. In order to use it for their research, they sometimes have to shuffle around sentences and then say it's not exactly the same data, so they can use it for their research. So that's the data set itself. Now that data goes into this model. So the current argument and the current lawsuits are, is this model also covered under fair use or not? Generally, it probably seems like it's not going to be covered by that. given how much copyright infringement is happening and the inability to control what people are doing with the outputs, and the lack of ability there for creators to be able to protect their work. So that's a problem. Again, there's ongoing litigation there. There's a class action lawsuit right now for the image generation piece, for violating artist rights who put their creations up on the internet. Current law does not have, it's too early really, but it doesn't have any clear guidance on who the ownership is of generative AI outputs, but it's probably not going to be the person who's giving the prompt to ChatGPT. So if I go and I ask for a story and then I go try to publish that story, I don't own that story as the prompter. That's really unlikely that I'm ever going to have the right to do that. But who does have the right to do that is still kind of an open question. And it'll probably be some time before all of this is settled. There'll probably be a lot of new regulation that gets introduced, but that's kind of like where we are now. And in the meantime, while it all continues to be fluid and uncertain, there's going to be a lot of people who are harmed by this, obviously. It's made even more challenging by kind of like the everybody does it problem. If you all maybe remember, like back in the day, YouTube didn't do a lot of blocking of its content of what people uploaded for videos, kind of a similar problem. But eventually companies got mad, companies like Disney, when people are uploading Disney movies to YouTube where people can watch them for free instead of paying Disney. Now they do a much better job regulating what gets uploaded and what doesn't and flagging those issues. So kind of a similar case. Over time it eventually got better, not that there's still not violations, but it was kind of an everybody does it sort of problem, and it wasn't until there was more regulation and guidelines on what needed to happen to get that to be in a better place. Still not perfect, but better than it used to be. And that's probably what's going to happen here as well. It's definitely going to continue to be a problem, and again, people are going to continue to be harmed by this in the meantime until it's settled. So I know this was a lot of, you responded that you wanted to talk about this. I don't know if there are additional questions. Obviously, Tim and I aren't lawyers, so we can't speak to like the legal intricacies of this, but I think we both expect there will be a lot of changes as these lawsuits progress, changes that eventually make their way to regulation. Any questions or thoughts? I know some of you are lawyers, so you might have things to teach us.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, if not, we can also go on to the ethics piece, because I think that's also pretty relevant here. Like we mentioned before, there's kind of, when you prompt for something, when you ask it to create something for you, generate something for you, there are some guardrails that happen between when it generates an output or tries to generate an output and when you see that. And again, those guardrails are intended to protect the user from toxic content. But that doesn't mean, that only covers so much. And it definitely doesn't mean that there aren't other biases in the data or ethical issues that are present. And some of the ethical issues are what we were just talking about in terms of ownership. But there are other ethical issues as well. So like some of the questions that we've been talking about is like, what exactly data gets used? Who's curating that data? Who's sifting through it to say this should be valid data that we should use to train this model, and which data should be excluded because it's biased, it would be unethical to include, et cetera. So who's making those decisions, right? And it's a lot of data to go through. So practically, I mean, in real life, no one is actually going through all of the data that gets used. And so who gets to decide that? For ChatGPT in particular, they took, I don't know if you remember at the beginning of the call, we were saying it's kind of two layered models. It's GPT-3 and then ChatGPT on top of that, kind of as two layered algorithms. For ChatGPT, they had people essentially write a bunch of answers to a bunch of different questions. I think like 10 or 20,000 questions. And so who created those answers? Who decided what the answers should be for those questions? There's potential biases there. And also, how can we make sure that those answers to those questions are consistent and that they're aligned with subject matter expertise? As well as the questions we were just saying about who gets credit for things that are used to create a new logo for a new company, for example. For me, like the biggest thing that bothers me is like, we all know how toxic the internet can be. Like, who sifted out those toxic things? And a lot of bias is unintentional, but inherent in our day-to-day language. And that language is then fed into this model, which really bothers me. especially for those of us who, are historically discriminated against. Like that furthers that problem. So there's a lot of ethical issues here and risks. So I'll hand it back to you, Tim, to talk a little bit more in detail about this. And again, if you have questions or thoughts, please share them in the chat.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that covers a lot of it. Yeah, the presence of bias in language is, I mean, obviously hardly need to, restate it, but it's everywhere in so many different ways. And, like the machine, like we've been saying, the way the algorithms work, it just dispassionately vacuums up everything and kind of plays back what it is. I think, Rachel, you had the quote somewhere in here of some people have called this a stochastic parrot, where it's just kind of parroting back whatever it heard kind of at semi-random. So that's a hard problem to cope with, but maybe in a way it makes us kind of like reflect a little bit on what we're putting out there. As far as trust, like one thing that the more I've kind of interacted with it, it seems to me like it's like an eager summer intern. Like you get a summer intern that's like in their second or third year of college and they don't know anything. They have good access to Wikipedia, no ethical compass, no professional experience, and they're not real smart. They're not really good at drawing inferences or thinking particularly. And you just have to supervise them really intensely. Because the one thing it can't do is probably what all of you are doing right now, which is probably most of you are like thinking about the stuff that Rachel said and that I said, and like your minds are leaping ahead to like, what's the implications for me? Or maybe you're like spacing out and thinking about what you're gonna have for dinner or whatever, but you're thinking under your own initiative. Your mind is like, going where it goes, but computers don't do that. Like there's not like all the hype around it. Like it's not whatever it is that is intelligence and thought, like it's nowhere capable of anything remotely like that. So really think of it as like kind of a goofy, eager intern that you ask it to do something, it's going to write something down for you. But like, the quality is suspect and the intent is suspect. It may save you some time, which is great, but like, you've got to really kind of, look at it with a careful eye and make the best use of it. Like, it's not to say it's all bad, but it may save you some time. It may be a useful tool, but just be careful.
Yeah.
I don't know, Rachel, anything else on
Oh, no, I don't think so. Thanks for adding that. And it reminds me of the example that you shared, Tim, where I think someone from this group had sent a video of someone like embedding ChatGPT into Google Sheets and then using it to help populate content. Well, like that's not that different than using Excel as a tool. Like you have all your formulas in Excel. It's kind of like that saves you a lot of time. So it's like an additional set of formulas that you can use in Excel. So like thinking of it like that, like it's a tool to help you speed up what you need to do. And then you still have to review everything because who knows what it's going to say if you don't keep an eye on it, like Tim was just saying. So I'm going to skip, I think, to our last slide. Tim was just referencing this, and also you'd asked for the link in the chat. I forget who it was, but you can go and sign up. It's free. It does kind of go up and down, so it's not always available 100% of the time. But if you go and it's available, you can just set up a free account and then log in and then start prompting it with different things and see what it does. And one of the things we did last summer with one of our intern groups was have them play Stump the AI with one of the image generation models that's out there to see like what can it do, what can't it do, where does it just like fail. And so that's what we encourage all of you to do as well. Like try to stump it, see what it gets wrong. I was playing around with it and asking it questions about my thesis topic to see what it would do. And it definitely got stuff wrong. And then I would correct it and then it would be like, oh, yes, you're right. And then it would say something wrong again. And it would eventually just agree with me. So it's kind of fun to play around with it. And I think the more you play around with it, the more you realize that it's like, maybe it's in this hype cycle where it's a little bit overhyped and it can't actually do everything that people think it's going to do. And it's definitely a big step forward and it's going to change a lot, but it's not like a magical silver bullet that's going to put us all out of work. So I guess that's my closing statement, I suppose. I don't know, Tim, if you have anything else you want to add.
No, I think that's right. Yeah, I agree. I know we're in a sense we're out of time. Rachel, you have a couple more minutes to stay on? Yeah, we can stick
Yep.
around for a few more minutes if folks have questions. I see, what are some of the types of uses that industry's looking to use it for, banking, financial service? I mean, this is the big question. Everybody is trying to figure that out. We as a consulting firm have had some of the big stakeholders in developing this actually come to us and say, so how do we make money from this thing? So like it's oftentimes the case that like a technology will launch and it won't necessarily have been thought through, like what's the commercial side of it. So I don't know, but like, anybody on this call could potentially come up with a great idea that could be very valuable commercially. There's no, some of the initial thoughts I guess that people had was like, well, I guess if I'm a company, I could use it as a chat bot for my customer service. But then it's like, well, wait a minute, it doesn't know anything about my products or my policies for handling customer. It doesn't know anything. So like, and it costs millions of dollars to train a bespoke model. So, the cost of making a new
Yeah.
is a blocker. The fact that you can only feed it a few thousand words is a blocker. But like somewhere in there probably are useful commercial applications. I'm sorry, Rachel, what were you going to say?
Oh no, I wanted to add to what you were saying.
Yeah.
And a pattern that's happened recently in the natural language processing space is you have this really, really big model. It knows a lot, but it doesn't know anything specific about the problems that you have or like your day-to-day work or your company. And so this is true even in previous years. We've been doing this for 3 or 4 years now, where we take a big open source model. It's not a generative AI model, but it's a big neural network kind of model. And we retrain it to be domain specific. So we don't have to come with as much data, but we take the big model and then say, focus on this one task. And that's pretty effective. You take kind of the broader knowledge of this really big model, and then you teach it on top of that to do something very specific. And I expect that's kind of what we'll see with some of these industries and the use cases that they might be interested in. For example, the finance space, they got a lot of documents, but it's all very domain specific to the financial services industry. And so they might want to take their data, not retrain a huge $12 million model, but they might want to target it to learn this specific thing. And so they might be able to use that big GPT model and then use their set of smaller data and retrain it to do something more specific. So that might be a use case, kind of general pattern, I guess, not a specific use case, that we might see across some of these industries. But like Tim said, I think everyone's kind of trying to brainstorm what the use cases will be to, on a big scale, use this to make an impact. Definitely on an individual level basis, I think we're seeing a lot of people using it to generate stuff that they then go do XYZ with. And Jennifer, I like the question about what happens when the goofy, eager intern grows up. I think we're all interested to see what that is, what happens. I'm certainly hoping for regulation, for more guardrails, more accountability, as that eager intern grows up, so that it's being used in an ethical and a safe way for everyone. And yeah, just having that accountability. So that's what I'm hoping to have happen as things continue to change, but we'll see. All
Great.
right. Anything else, Tim?
No, I guess we should respect everybody's time and probably wrap it up. But if you have, our contact info is in the pages. I guess we didn't really think about this. I guess we can post a PDF of this somewhere. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll make the material available. You feel free to contact Rachel or me anytime. And yeah, thanks for all of your questions and engagement.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.